Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you are doing well. This week's Dvar Torah I want to do in the merit and in the memory of the IDF soldier Barel Shmueli, who passed away from his wounds after being shot at the Gaza border. May his neshama have an aliyah, and may his memory be for a blessing. So this week's parsha is Nitzavim. Nitzavim means standing. You are all standing. Atem Nitzavim. And we are kind of nearing the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Dvarim. We have a few weeks left until we actually start the whole Torah over, because even though Rosh Hashanah is this coming Tuesday, we don't actually start the Torah over at the head of the new year. We start the Torah over at Simchat Torah, which makes sense because we're rejoicing in the completion of the Torah, and then we begin Bereshit. So we have a few more parshiot left. But again, if we just a little bit of a recap, that the first 4 books of the Torah happen over a long period of time. In fact, 70 years pass it sometimes between a sentence. But the entire book of Deuteronomy happens only over 5 weeks. And these are the final 5 weeks of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher's life, where he's giving the last of his wisdom to the Jewish people before setting them free into Eretz Yisrael, the land that he does not get to enter. So in this parsha, we have a renewal of the Brit, of the covenant that God has with the Jewish people. And what does this mean when we say like the Brit, the covenant? What does it mean? It just means it's a renewal of the agreement that the Jewish people have with God, meaning God will grant us blessings in return for us walking on the Derech Hashem, the way of God, following God's mitzvot and leading righteous lives. So it's a renewal of a covenant. And in the text where we're renewing this covenant, Moshe says it is for every single person, not just the people who are hearing me speak today, but also for future generations. And it's a beautiful thing to imagine, because sometimes we can feel like this is, thousands of years ago. How can this relate to me? When in literally the words for word say, it is not this covenant, these mitzvot, these commandments are not just for the people that are here. They're for us, for people who are listening thousands of years later. And when we wonder, why is this relevant to us? It's relevant because it was a mitzvah, it was a commandment on us as well. Another little thing to remember is that there is this Kabbalistic idea that every soul that will ever or has ever existed was present at the giving of the Torah, that there were 600,000 souls at the giving of the Torah, and that all of those souls, bits of those souls, are now existing in all of us. So it's true that not only were these commandments given to us, our bits of our souls back then, but also to future generations of those souls, which are us now. So either way, we're still chayav, it's still incumbent upon us to obey these mitzvot. So like I said, as you are all standing here, so this idea of accessible Torah is one that I want to talk about today. So in my email this week, if you don't get it, let me know. I'll be happy to add you on my email this week. I talk about my tour guide for the birthright trip that I led. So it was this guy named Ron. We're going to call him Ron. He was very typical Israeli, meaning that he was not really so into the religious aspect of Judaism. This is a topic to talk a lot about, but there is a lot of animosity and tension between the ultra-Orthodox groups in Israel and then the secular groups in Israel. The number one main conflict there is that ultra-Orthodox Jews do not serve in the army out of religious exemption, and secular Israelis do. And so there's sort of animosity that secular Israelis feel like, it is incumbent upon all citizens to support the state of Israel. And then also Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, oftentimes do learn for a living and have very, very low salaries, meaning that they don't contribute that much in taxes. And they also get government funding because their taxes are so low. I think it's ever like 53% of ultra-Orthodox Jews live under the poverty line in Israel. So this is not a judgment. This is me just sharing the facts. But basically, Ron, our tour guide, like most Israelis, that's a most secular Israelis, big assumption. Please, we can talk about this more in depth, but big assumption is that Ron wasn't a huge fan of religious Jews. So when I was leading the trip, I would try to make every single moment a teachable moment. So we'd be driving to Sfat and I'd be teaching. I'd commandeer the bus microphone and try to share ideas about the ancient Kabbalists of Sfat and, talk about Shalom Aleichem, the song Shalom Aleichem that was written in Sfat, that Lecha Dodi that was written in Sfat, all of these things that are Kabbalistic in nature, or just share like Torah ideas, like, oh, now we're driving through this area where this happened. And Ron would, roll his eyes good-naturedly. He wasn't like so into it. I asked him nicely to read one of the Parshiot, one of the Aliyahs for the Torah reading on the Saturday morning of the trip, because we did a little bar mitzvah ceremony. So that was also special. Anyway, he was being exposed to a lot of Jewish things that I don't think were typical for him. And I knew the whole time he wasn't so into the Jewish things, but on the last day, he shared a really beautiful idea with all of us. He said that growing up, he really didn't feel connected to his Judaism. And after being in the army, he traveled to India and was so fascinated by the Indian and Buddhist cultures. He was like, wow, look at these people who are so connected to a people from thousands and thousands of years ago. I wish that I was connected to an ancient people from thousands and thousands of years ago. And then he realized, being in India far away, that he was. Of course, Ron is a Jew. Ron is connected to those souls that were standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. Ron is connected to the people who live in the land of Israel, this miracle that we have returned to the land, to the Eretz HaKodesh, the Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, the land flowing with milk and honey that we were given literally in the Torah. He is living amongst those ancient people, but he didn't realize it until he was far away. And I always think about Ron when I read this particular Parsha Nitzavim. So I'm going to read you the part that I'm particularly thinking about when I think of Ron. Okay, so here's the part. It's in the 6th Aliyah. For this commandment, just general commandments in general, which I command you this day, it is not concealed from you, nor is it far away. It is not in heaven, lo vashamayim he, that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and fetch it for us, to tell it to us so that we can fulfill it, nor is it beyond the sea, velo me'ever layam, that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and fetch it for us, to tell it to us so that we can fulfill it. Rather, this thing is very close to you, ki karov alecha hadavar me'od. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can fulfill it. Okay, so that doesn't need so much explanation. This thing, ki karov alecha, this thing is very close to you. This is the idea of Torah, that Torah is accessible by all. God is accessible by all. Mitzvot is accessible by all. And you don't need an intermediary. You don't need someone to, you don't need to say, oh, it's in heaven, so we need someone to go up and get it for us and then come back and then explain it to us. No. This is accessible to everyone. And it's beautiful that this particular passage is so understandable by all. I think anyone who reads this can see, wow, this is telling us that Torah is for everyone. And it's a great equalizer. It's really beautiful. And the reason I think about Ron with this is that a Torah and a life of Judaism that was meaningful to him was around him his entire life growing up as an Israeli. But until he went away and saw other cultures, did he realize what he actually had around him. So that's the idea about ki karov alecha. It is this thing is close to you. Just such a beautiful idea. So that is Nitzavim. Shabbat Shalom. Wishing you all a great weekend, and I will hopefully see you on Rosh Hashanah, God willing.